All right. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Our final session. I am so excited to have Coach Lee here. Before I turn it over to her, I do want to just take a moment and acknowledge that I am currently on the unceded and ancestral territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Coast Salish people, and I'm incredibly grateful to be on this land. I'm going to turn it over to you, Coach Lee.
Thank you so much, Amy. And I'd like to acknowledge I'm on the unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq. I actually am in Nova Scotia for the weekend, and I'm originally from Toronto. And I'm really thankful to be here joining you all in our Women in Sport speaker series. So before I get into my PowerPoint, I have a short video I'd like to show you all because our topic today is on anti-racism in the Canadian sports community.
I'm a football coach.
I'm a football coach.
I'm a football coach.
I'm a football coach.
I am a flag football coach.
And I'm a football coach.
I am a football coach.
Je suis un entraîneur de football.
I'm a football coach.
I'm a football coach.
I'm a football coach.
I'm a football coach.
I am a football coach.
I am a football coach.
I am a football coach.
Players need and want to see themselves in their coaches.
And more importantly, in positions of leadership.
The Black Football Coaches of Canada are working hard to ensure
that the diversity of coaching and administration in our game
reflects the diversity of the game itself.
Mais actuellement, nous sommes loin de cette marque dans le football canadien.
Racism exists. I felt it.
I felt it.
Je l'ai senti.
I felt it.
Football is no exception.
Join us in working to change the narrative.
Because the time to change the game is now.
Like millions of Canadians.
So today we're going to have a conversation about anti-racism in the Canadian sports community. And before we do, I'd like to acknowledge a few things. This is not meant to be a comprehensive review of anti-racism initiatives and programs in our Canadian sports community. Rather, I hope throughout the next kind of 40 minutes to an hour to talk to you about some of the recent programming and initiatives and things that we've seen in our Canadian sports community at various levels that is helping us become more culturally inclusive, that is helping us have more conversations about anti-racism and what it means in the Canadian sport community. My goal for this presentation is for everyone watching to be able to walk away from this, maybe with a few things that they didn't know that they can go and learn more about. It might also be some information that has already come across your desk. Ultimately, we talk a lot about the need for education and the need for more research in order to understand what it truly means to be anti-racist. And I hope in some of these very few ways that I've been able to play a small role in or learn about initiatives that are being created, that it can encourage you on our collective sport path, I would say, because this is all this is a big part of what we want to do in our Canadian sports community. Firstly, I want to acknowledge the Aboriginal Sports Circle, which is a not-for-profit organization that was founded in 1995. And if I'm not mistaken, the Aboriginal Sports Circle has been sort of the leading Canadian national voice for Aboriginal sport. And it really has presented the only precedent from like a cultural diversity standpoint for advocacy for racialized people. And there are a ton of things that the ASC does. I don't know all of them, but as you can see in the tab there, they do coaching awards, they run programming, they work with different territorial groups across Canada. And in just a little bit of research I've been able to do on the Aboriginal Sports Circle the last few years, I found this organization to be extremely influential in terms of how I've even thought about, hey, what does advocacy look like? What does celebration look like? And how can we work with other groups in the community or the government level or the high performance level, for example, that can help us get to that level? One of the things coming up this summer actually is Canada Summer Games, which are sort of like like an amateur perspective level of like the Olympics in Canada. And one of the really cool things that the ASC actually helps facilitate is Aboriginal apprentice coaches that actually work alongside coaches and teams in basketball specifically. And so that's kind of just one example of a really great way to see some of that intentionality around cultural inclusivity and anti-racism in our Canadian sport community. And as I go through this presentation, if there's any information that I'm giving you that is new or that is interesting, I strongly encourage you to take note of it. To take note of it. And again, do more research and see the good things that are happening right now in this space.
Coach Lee, I'm just going to stop you. We can't actually see your slides. You might need to bring them back to your front. Okay.
Sorry. Can you see me?
I can see you.
Oh my gosh. Okay. Sorry. I need to screen share again. Sorry about that. Should I do that part again on the Aboriginal Sports Circle?
No, you're all good.
Okay.
Perfect. Thank you.
Oh my goodness. Just trying to make this big here. Are we good here, Amy?
Yeah, we can see your slides now.
Okay, perfect. In 2019, the Canadian government launched Building a Foundation for Change, Canada's anti-racism strategy. Being a longtime coach in the Canadian sport community at the university level and at the perspective level and at the high performance level, I had no idea this was a thing. And so if you look at the strategy from 2019 to 2022, it's really interesting. It talks about various ways that the government can impact change by working with, again, community groups, working with different cultural groups, working with different arms of the Canadian government to see some change. So over the last 3 or 4 years, we've actually seen a lot of support for the first time ever from a governmental standpoint, going back to, let's say, equity-seeking groups, Black and Indigenous-led programming, and similar initiatives. In 2020, when I started doing some research around anti-racism in Canadian sport, following some experiences that I had with racism, I actually, for lack of better terms, I was floored because I had no idea that this was something that had already been set in motion. And so if you haven't heard about Canada's anti-racism strategy, I encourage you to go back and look through some of those governmental files. A few things that stood out to me. So one of the things that stood out to me is the lack of information around anti-Black racism, and more specifically, the research grounded in that. And we know that the government of Canada, through Sport Canada and through a number of partners, such as NSOs and PTSOs, actually provide a lot of resources. And so right away, it had me thinking, okay, maybe we don't have the research in this space, because if one were to look at Canadian specific resources or research, we wouldn't really have much. And so that's something that kind of stood out to me. Overall, I mean, I think this is really important because it shows almost a watershed era in terms of what the Canadian government is willing to do in different arms of the government. For our conversations, we're talking more specifically about what Sport Canada is doing and through the cultural heritage and arts branch. But I will say that, again, over the last few years, we've seen for the first time different kinds of supports for underserved groups, including women, Indigenous groups, newcomer groups, and so forth. And again, I'm talking to you as someone who is in the sports space, and I'm not well-versed in all of the arms of the government. But again, at the height of COVID, and we're going to talk a little bit more about kind of Black Lives Matter and the movement and how it influenced different areas of our sport community. This is kind of where I fell on. And so it's a really interesting resource. It's very thorough, but again, one of the things that I was able to identify is that there were definitely some gaps in terms of, hey, you know, what groups are being advocated for and what aren't. Historically speaking, we've seen a lot of support go towards Indigenous groups, rightfully so. But again, when we look at the outcomes in education, in health, in sport participation, we're not necessarily seeing the influx of Indigenous groups in mainstream sport and high performance sport, right? And so we know that there is still a gap that exists there. I think this is a great starting point for us. And I think the more we're knowledgeable on, hey, what are the ways in which the Canadian government is supporting and advancing cultural diversity in sport, we can help to further bridge that gap. I also would like to say that we would like this strategy to continue past 2022. Again, I don't know what the next step is, but we certainly would like to see the government continue to advance more supports towards this. I'd mentioned earlier that I started to do some research around, hey, what does anti-racism look like from a government standpoint, or really at any level? Like, what do we have from a research-driven standpoint that's Canadian specific? And the more and more research I did, the more I understood that, hey, we actually don't have a lot of our own research. We rely heavily on American sport research. So this would be things that cover professional sports. These would be things that cover the NCAA, one of the largest, obviously, amateur organizations in North America. And it was really difficult to find anything Canadian specific. And I started to ask questions why. In some of this research, I stumbled upon the Institute for Diversity and Ethics in Sport, which is run out of the University of Central Florida. And Dr. Richard Lapchick is a director. And what I uncovered is TIDES actually, for a long time, has been creating racial and gender equity report cards for sport organizations at the professional level and at the collegiate post-secondary level. And I thought, man, this is cool. This is awesome. Where's ours? Where's one for Canada, considering 56 Canadian universities, 150 some Canadian colleges. And again, in that institutional space, in that post-secondary space, because of the intersection of sport, of amateurism, of education, it's the perfect place to get this kind of really important information. And so TIDES, I think it's an incredible organization in terms of what they do, but what it represented, at least to me, was a precedent of what this can look like for our Canadian sport community, and specifically in the collegiate post-secondary space, where when we talk about accountability and we talk about experiences and we talk about youth and marginalized groups, we know that that's a really, really pivotal moment of life and sport experience. So I'd like to jump here to kind of 2020 when COVID hit. And I guess the first thing I want to get across, which I'm sure everybody's heard this, is, life really came to a standstill with the outbreak of COVID. And it wasn't that this is the first time that a call for Black Lives Matter happened, but the biggest difference on all accounts is that people saw it, everybody saw it. Everybody saw the things in the media that was, whether it was sensationalized, whether it was explicit and traumatizing for some. And it was the first time that racialized and non-racialized people at arguably every level came together and said, enough is enough. We've seen sport be a landscape for advancing racial equity. One of my favorite quotes is from Nelson Mandela: "Sport can change the world, has the power to inspire. It speaks to the youth in a language that they can understand. It is more powerful than the government in breaking barriers." Right? Nelson Mandela said that. We've seen professional athletes use their personal platforms, such as a Colin Kaepernick. But again, the difference here, I really do feel like, is because the outbreak of COVID and the onset of racialized violence created this space and time where you couldn't just turn away. And, everyone I talk to in the sports space, whether it be, a post-secondary athlete, a longtime coach, a sport administrator, felt the same way, and felt different things. And I think overall for our Canadian sport community, everyone felt like, okay, we got to do something and we need to do it together. And so to me, this was, 2020 was truly a watershed year. From a personal standpoint, I really felt it for a number of reasons. At the time, I was a university university women's basketball coach. And, I'm a single Black female living in a rural town. And, with COVID, it was like legally you couldn't talk to people. And, practically my whole career has been, predicated on communicating with, athletes, young people, old people, coaches, doing community work, et cetera, et cetera. And so that was really difficult. But from a personal standpoint, I lost a brother who passed away by suicide. And one of the things that he struggled with was racism, working in corporate Canada in a space where he was one of two people of color. And so I felt personally a sense of conviction that, hey, like I got to do something. And when I started to kind of look around and communicate to people virtually, I found that a lot of people felt the same way, for different reasons. And so again, I point to this 2020 year because so many things started to happen. These are a few pictures that I've put together because I'm going to talk a little bit about, what are some of the outcomes from this. COVID has happened. We're seeing racialized violence at an unprecedented level, or perhaps it's not at an unprecedented level, but it's at one that is a lot more out there. It's in the media, it's in your face. There's no way to hide from it. And we saw different reactions, right? And so on the left there, we have, a Twitter video put together by the Rugby Sevens, which is a rugby women's national team, one of their age groups, talking about, what anti-racism and inclusivity means to them. In the middle here, we have Golf Canada's first introduction of First Tee, which is a program that's specifically designed to provide opportunities to develop golf skills and a love for golf to marginalized groups and members of our newcomer community and people who live in priority areas. On the right, we see National Sport Organization Canada Basketball launching a strategic 3-year plan that really works through, hey, these are ways that we will enhance diversity and equity. And, if I'm gonna be honest, when Black Tuesday hit, and that's kind of what everybody calls that 2020 period, there was a day where everyone posted a Black screen and everybody stood in solidarity, specifically for anti-Black racism. I think everyone felt compelled to say something, but not everyone did something. And so when we talk about what being anti-racism means, it's not just saying, it's not just this is what I feel in the moment, it's outcome-based, right? The performative pieces, a lot of people felt it's performative if you're posting a Black screen, but then you're doing nothing to follow up on that call to action. And so what was monumental were some of these things that were happening. We had, for example, amateur and professional athletes saying, hey, I'm gonna speak up without worry of how this will impact my participation on this team, or how people will think about what I say. We have, for the first time, organizations saying, hey, we need to allocate funding, we need to allocate personnel and knowledge mobilization to these specific things. And so again, a really important period of time. On this slide here, I have a few individuals I like to talk about. There's a picture of myself, so I will get to that. I was trying not to put myself, but I guess I'll explain when I get there. And these are just a small percentage of individuals who I personally feel have played a role or have represented advancements in racial equity and in anti-racism efforts. And I'm hoping that some of these faces look familiar, but they may also not. And again, I encourage you to do some additional research. So at the top left here, we have Dr. Ivan Joseph. Dr. Ivan Joseph is, if I'm not mistaken, he's the VP of Academic Affairs at Wilfrid Laurier University, which also happens to be my alma mater, go Golden Hawks. Dr. Ivan Joseph is U Sport's only former Black athletic director. He's got an incredible resume. He's a motivational speaker and author. He's done a ton in inclusivity even before it was a quote unquote thing in the sport community. A former soccer coach, he's got a bunch of stuff online. The reason why I have Dr. Ivan Joseph's picture up here is because he played a role, and I'm going to talk a little bit about when he was at Ryerson University as the athletic director. He played a role, I believe, in really changing what collegiate athletics looked like from a basketball sense. And what I feel like the impact of that was. So Ryerson is regarded as, Toronto Metropolitan University, which is what was formerly known as Ryerson, represents one of the most diverse schools in all of Canada. And Dr. Ivan Joseph was hired as an athletic director, and in doing so, he became the first Black athletic director. And what he started to do was think differently about qualified coaches and what the impact of opening doors to those people would be. One of the people that he hired was Roy Rana. Roy Rana is a former NBA coach, longtime national team coach. I think he's actually coaches for like the Dubai national team. He's got an incredible resume. Roy Rana is of Indian descent. He was a very, very successful high school basketball coach and athletic director and administrator. And with Ivan hiring Roy Rana, he turned around and was able to open the door to other people of color that he was able to hire in as coaches or other underserved groups. And just sticking in the basketball space, to what I know, he also hired Carly Clark. Carly Clark is one of our most accomplished female basketball coaches in Canada. She's actually coming off of an undefeated season in the OUA, in U Sports, and more recently, last week won a gold at Canada's U23 Global Jam. So she's technically still undefeated. But back, I'm getting a little bit off track here. But Dr. Ivan Joseph, in being intentional about thinking about what certification and qualifications mean for underserved groups and thinking about it differently, opened the doors for more inclusivity and more diversity. And in doing so, it started to change the culture at Ryerson University. We started to see a lot more athletes of color. And I do feel that I don't have enough knowledge to kind of say this as a fact, but I do feel like what we saw happening in the athletic department was also mirrored in the administrative space. And I feel like I kind of want to stick specifically to the sports, but again, with some research, you'll see that over the last decade or so, Ryerson has been leading in this space. And Dr. Ivan Joseph is one of the people I credit for that. In addition to that, over the last 3 or 4 years, when we've been having this conversation about anti-racism in sports, Dr. Ivan Joseph, with a very strong authority, I guess, on the athletics piece and the institutional and administrative piece, has been someone that has actually played a leading role in a lot of equity audits at athletic departments, which I'll talk about later. And so Dr. Ivan Joseph, a leader in many ways, and definitely somebody that I wanted to point out. To the right of him is Gord Grace. Gord Grace is currently president and CEO of Ontario University Athletics, which is Canada's largest Canadian university sport conference. Don't really know how many teams there are, probably over 20 or so. And so it's one of 4 conferences, in addition to Canada West, RSEQ or RSEC, as well as the AUS, Atlantic University Sport, which is here on the East Coast of Canada. And the reason why I point Gord Grace out is because he played a leadership role, again, at the height of COVID and Black Lives Matter, in terms of, hey, what do we do now? We've got all these student athletes and all these coaches that want to help, want to have conversations, want to show their support, want to stand in solidarity. And Gord Grace put together a committee called the Black, Biracial, and Indigenous Committee, which was pretty much comprised of OUA coaches and athletes to start having these conversations. And that was the context in which I met him when I was doing some of the BCCA work. And, Gord is a perfect example of what we talk of what we speak about when we say allyship. And, again, that I don't even like using the word accountability, but being action oriented in, hey, what does it actually mean to give up power? What does it actually mean to be an ally? And the BBI started off as an almost ad hoc group with some informal meetings. They actually brought in Dr. Ivan Joseph in some of their early calls, and turned into a more formalized committee group that operated throughout the year and eventually created two significant pieces of work. The first was a presentation to administer to athletic directors in the OUA at the annual AGM. And the second is a historic piece of work called the OUA's anti-racism report. So again, none of this is possible without the intentionality of the president and CEO of the OUA. Now you're probably thinking, did this happen anywhere else around the country? And the answer is no, it didn't. And I think, there's a lot of different factors to consider, and some that I surely don't know. But I can tell you that a lot of work has been done, whether it be by institutions at other conferences or by executive administrators in other conferences. But in terms of, again, impact, setting a precedent, playing a role in terms of what does anti-racism mean, Gord Grace is a perfect example of what we would consider an ally in this space. To the right of him, we have Lorraine Lafreniere. She is the CEO of the Coaching Association of Canada. So that's, it's Canada's largest coaching organization. They're considered the gold standard. They've got over 200,000 members across the country. If you want to coach in any formal capacity, you have to register with the Coaching Association of Canada. They've been a leader in terms of women in coaching, in terms of mentorship programs. And Lorraine actually has put a lot of her attention towards responsible coaching and safe sport movements. And the reason why I have her up there is because on Black Tuesday, so that's the day when everybody kind of posted the Black screen in solidarity, I was on Twitter and different outlets writing down the organizations, the big ones at least, that were putting their fist up, because I wanted to do follow-ups and figure out, hey, what does this look like? And I remember I sent an email actually to Lorraine, and I just kind of quoted, okay, this is what Coaching Association of Canada said, just wanted to follow up, what does this look like? And I honestly feel like if this was a conversation I had 2 years before or a year before, it would have been like, who's this young woman calling me? Like, who are you again? Like, that kind of level. And she was so open to talking to me. She was open to my ideas. And the Coaching Association of Canada is actually the first organization that we were able to partner with as a new not-for-profit. And when I say we, I mean the Black Canadian Coaches Association. And why that was so important for us is because right away, it gave us clout. It gave us a recognizable organization. It gave us confidence to talk about, hey, what does this actually look like? And the CAC was able to empower us, and in partnership, we launched the Black Female Coach Mentorship Program, Canada's first mentorship program specifically to advance Black, biracial, and Afro-mixed women in coaching. And I can tell you, when I started coaching at the university basketball level in 2018, I was the youngest coach in the country at the time, youngest head coach. And I was only the fourth Black female coach in Canadian university basketball. It's just a space that there haven't been many people of color. And so to launch a program like this, thinking about what it means for visibility, thinking about what it means for representation, thinking about what it means for encouragement, thinking about what it means for impact. I mean, it was monumental, and so Lorraine's leadership in that moment of, no, we're not just going to talk about it, we're going to be about it too. That was huge for us as the BCCA. And in turn, we've been able to turn around and provide really special catered peer-to-peer mentorship across the country. And so I wanted to shout out Lorraine. I myself, I'm the founder of the BCCA. And the reason why I have my picture up there is not because I'd like to shout myself out. It's because I feel like a lot of people, a lot of organizations, I feel like that's what I represent. I represent almost a connecting piece. And I've played a very small role in terms of helping to bridge the gap. and how we talk about anti-racism, which I'll get more to. Actually, I could just mention it now. So with the Coaching Association of Canada, just a few months ago, we actually launched Canada's first anti-racism in sport e-learning modules for coaches and sport administrators. And this is a tool that many people have been asking for years. And even if they haven't explicitly been asking for it, in understanding the sport experiences of individuals across all levels of sport, it's just been a huge gap for us, right? And so again, just talking about that connecting piece and how I've been really lucky to kind of be in some of these rooms and meet these incredible people to help start some of these programs and initiatives. To the right of me is Corey Grant. Corey Grant's currently the head coach of football at Carleton University. He was most recently at McMaster University. And at the height of COVID, and he's actually, Corey is a former CFL player. He's been coaching a while. He is a licensed teacher, and so he's also a longtime teacher. And I actually met Corey in the very beginnings of the BCCA. He's our assistant director. And when I met him, you know, he was extremely compelled to do something. And what he actually started to do was pick up the phone and call all the coaches, all the football coaches across the country that he knew, to find out, hey, how are we having these conversations with our young men who play football? You know, how do I have these conversations with the young men of color that are looking for psychosocial support, that are looking for answers, that are trying to understand how to navigate in this space? And so with the BCCA, we actually have sport-specific groups, and basketball was our first one, football was our second one. And, you know, since then, Corey has been playing a leadership role in advancing EDI at various levels. So at McMaster, they launched the first apprenticeship program for female coaches in football. He's used his platform on numerous occasions. He's a community activist. And, you know, he's the founder of the Black Football Coaches of Canada. So that really cool video that I showed you in the beginning, this year, with the support of Football Canada, we actually launched the first ever BIPOC football coaches mentorship program. And so again, we're getting into that space, and we know how monumental mentorship can be, but we're getting into that space where we can have some intentionality around supporting racialized people. And so the mentorship program is really cool. You know, it's men, women, non-binary folks in both contact, touch, and flag football. The bottom right there is Cheryl Jean-Paul. Cheryl Jean-Paul, I met in 2017 or 18. And, you know, I'm a big hoop head. That means I love basketball. But Cheryl was announced as the U16 national team head coach. And as someone who grew up playing basketball and, you know, trying out for the provincial team and watching the national team, I never, ever thought in my life I would see a Black woman be named the head coach of anything in our national sport organization. I didn't even think it was possible, right? And so it kind of makes you think about that adage that people keep saying about, you know, you can't be what you don't see. And I know it kind of, you know, again, is it played out? Is it cliche? But I'm telling you, I was floored. I walked into Humber College. Somebody said, that's a head coach of the U16 team. I had to do a double take. When I started coaching at the university level, I actually I went through some very difficult experiences, and I was connected with Cheryl, and she's been a mentor to me since. Actually, earlier today, Cheryl was coaching our U17 women's team in Hungary against France. And so she's an incredible coach, an incredible person. And I can tell you that even in my coaching experience, being able to connect with one of a few Black female coaches that can identify with maybe some of the challenges or some of the experiences that I was undergoing, you know, across the country in, you know, rural Antigonish, and she's across the country, you know, she actually coaches at Trinity Western University, but just being able to bridge that gap was monumental for me. It's part of the reason I'm still coaching, and she's a true inspiration. She's also a leader in sport, and so Trinity Western University, they do an annual leadership conference, and they were able to facilitate some specific conversations around anti-racism and inclusivity. And they actually helped us with a fundraiser for the BCCA. So again, this is not meant to be, like pictures of people who can only be credited with advancing racial equity. But when we talk about, hey, like, what does anti-racism look like? These are definitely, maybe with the exception, not me, but the 5 faces you see here have been monumental in some of these advancements. The Black North Initiative is a program that was founded by Wes Hall. Wes Hall is the gentleman on your bottom left there. And Wes Hall is an immigrant from Jamaica. He's one of the wealthiest men in Canada. Actually, this year he was named the first Black male Dragon's Den member. And so he's on the show. He's a serial entrepreneur, investor, the whole nine. And in going back to that COVID and Black Lives Matter period, he also felt a strong sense of conviction as someone who's super successful, works in the financial district, is extremely successful. Even someone like him wasn't able to escape some of these experiences of getting pulled over by the police, of being called names, of being scrutinized in ways that, were discriminative. And so with the help of some very powerful people in the Canadian corporate sector, he actually launched the Black North Initiative. If you haven't heard about Black North Initiative or BNI, definitely do your homework on it. One of the things that they created early on were different committees, and one of them was a sport committee. He brought on Donovan Bailey, one of our most esteemed and accomplished sprinters and Olympians, as well as Isaiah Thomas, who's actually American, but played a leading role actually in the advancement of basketball after the Raptors was founded in 1995. And so why I thought this was really important is because what Wes Hall did was, he's somebody who represents corporate Canada. Corporate Canada in various ways impacts the support we get for sport, right? Like, because they're named partners. So for example, you take our U Sport landscape, there's a number of corporate sponsors. And he actually put together a pledge. And if you can't see it, I'll just read it here, but it's a pledge. It's time for anti-Black racism to end. And so he started going to members in corporate Canada and asked them to sign a pledge that, if I'm not mistaken, by the year 2025, you will have at least, I think it's like 3% of your executive positions being held by people who identify as Black. And so again, working towards intentionality of racial inclusivity. And, it started off as something that was personal for him. But as he formalized things and put it together, the support just, it just started to come from everywhere. And so now we see Black North Initiative supporting Boys and Girls Clubs. They've got a number of, corporate partners. I don't know exactly how many organizations have taken the pledge, but the work is constantly being done. And so if you haven't heard of BNI, definitely do your research on them. And yeah, like Wes Hall is definitely one of the people that we can credit for advancing racial equity in our Canadian sports community. Maybe not directly, but again, in empowering individuals who are in the sports space to have an impact. He's been doing that, and he's been, holding people to account in terms of that. What we started to see as well is the creation of new sport organizations and sport organizations that already exist, also stepping up, using their platforms in ways that we've never seen. So the WNBA actually for a long time have been advocates for a variety of social issues. The NBA, we saw at unprecedented levels, individual athletes and teams, even to the point of not playing games to protest in terms of the racism that was occurring in society. On the top left there, you see Asher Hill, a famous professional figure skater who founded the Figure Skating Diversity and Inclusion Alliance. We see the HDA, Hockey Diversity Alliance, on the bottom right. We see the MLS Black players for change. And so what I find to be really cool is that, I don't think that there's necessarily, I don't think that it matters for us, hey, when did this organization actually start, within the context of what we've seen the last 2-3 years. What matters is that they exist. What matters is that they've got similar mandates around advancing racial equity and anti-racism generally. And we see a lot of the same themes, right? We see education, we see representation, we see knowledge mobilization. We see for the first time this intersection of people with platforms on a national level, sometimes on a global level, that are really continuing this conversation. Okay, one of the things I wanted to talk about is really the first ever anti-Black racism review that was done at the Canadian University level. And I kind of mentioned before, in corporate Canada and different corporations, for many years, there's been, bias training, there's been prejudice and bias training, but taking it to that level of anti-Black racism is fairly new. And so McMaster University, I mentioned Corey Grant was there at the time. Dr. Ivan Joseph was actually brought in to lead this study. And what we had was a number of alumni from the athletics department actually speak out around their experiences of racism and specifically anti-Black racism. And so something like a 3 to 5 month equity audit was done by sitting with current athletes, former athletes, current coaches, et cetera. And what came of this was a pretty thick report around the environment, I would say, and the culture of athletics at McMaster University. And I don't show this to point out McMaster in a bad way. I actually think it's the opposite. When McMaster did this, it created a whole new standard, one that we haven't seen, one that is similar to going back to TIDES and the Institute of Diversity and Ethics in Sport, one that gets us away from, hey, this is just a you thing, or, that's just a personal experience, but, there's no commonality. And it takes us to a point where things are research-based. Research is what informs institutions. Once we have that information and we know that it's backed up with research, now there's nothing you can say. Now we know, again, if you speak to a person of color who's gone through racism, we know what that feels like and we can tell you. But we also understand that, again, research informs institutions. And so it set an amazing, incredible, monumental standard for now, hey, what this actually should look like, because now we've got tangible data around where some growth areas are that we can be better in. And so I can only imagine what this meant for McMaster University as a whole and for the athletics department, but ultimately I commend them because this is what every school in the country should have done, to be honest. If you do the research and go back and look at the reports, and these are all available publicly, you'll see, and if you speak to now racialized persons at other universities, you will see almost verbatim, if you were to ask them and they put down their experiences on paper, the same things happening. And, I actually had, a leadership member at the school I formerly worked at say to me, oh my goodness, look at this, look at some of these quotes, and my response was, yeah, like, this is what it is. This is what it is almost everywhere. This is what it is. Like, I can pull up, former alumni and and so again, I commend McMaster, and I think people need to acknowledge schools for that. Does it mean that, any school is perfect? No, absolutely not. However, these are the things that we need to do. This is a level that we need to get at to take anti-racism seriously. We have to start thinking about how we're creating some tangible information that we can then mobilize into actions, right? And the other thing I'll add is, as much as we see different commonalities, it might look a little bit different. French Canada is different than English Canada. An experience in a rural town at a university might be completely different than in a city. And so there is a real need for research around this, because as much as we might see the same themes in terms of the outcomes and how we move forward and how we pose solutions, that is going to look different. But we can't get to that point unless we're willing to hold the mirror up like McMaster did and have these kind of studies. A lot of what was going on, I had mentioned I felt some conviction to do something. And, you know, in creating the BCCA, it's something that in a perfect world, I wanted to get some research together, you know, bring it to somebody who already had a platform, you know, like a Pinball Clemens. Like, he was somebody that I was really hoping I could get in touch with to say, hey, here's something that we can kind of do for 3 reasons. We can celebrate racialized people. It can be an opportunity to network. And, you know, we can connect allies and advocates. And again, because of the timing, because of the sense of urgency and immediacy to do something, and I was fortunate enough to have a lot of colleagues and mentors and support, I was able to launch a BCCA. And thereby, it helped to connect allies and racialized persons. I'll talk a little bit about the BCCA and kind of what we do. Perhaps I should have talked about this in the beginning, but I kind of wanted to introduce how, like, what are the things that got us to this point, right? That led to organizations like the BCCA, because we're not the only ones that are doing, you know, the work. But I mentioned the Black Female Coach Mentorship Program being, you know, Canada's first coach mentorship program for racialized coaches identify as women. We actually held Beyond the Sideline series that allowed us to create platforms for coaches, for athletes and young people, for sport administrators to have uncomfortable conversations. And these were hosted virtually. On the left there, we've got one of the flyers for the Anti-Racism in Coaching e-learning module that we did in partnership with the Coaching Association of Canada. We're actually about to launch the first BIPOC hockey coach mentorship program in partnership with the NHL and the NHLPA. And so there's a lot of really good work being done. Hasn't come without its challenges. It's definitely hard. There's not much support in terms of the day-to-day and what it looks like. But, you know, we hope that all of the organizations and individuals that want to continue to improve our sport landscape look to us as an organization that can support. University of Toronto's Ideas Lab. So the Ideas Lab was founded by Janelle Joseph, who's an assistant professor. And Janelle Joseph is a rock star. I probably should have had her picture instead of mine a few slides ago. When I started to do some early research around, hey, what does anti-racism look like in wording, right? At the post-secondary level, at the high performance level, what research has been done with a Canadian lens? In doing so, I reached out to Janelle, and, you know, one of the things that she told me was, hey, we've been trying to do this research. Sport historians, critical race theorists, it's been an area where academics have actually tried to come into, but without, I guess for lack of a better term, like the allies or the sport partners to justify, hey, what does this look like? So now again, going back to COVID and Black Lives Matter, it opened that door. One of the first things we did as a BCCA was partner with the Ideas Research Lab, so that anytime that we're actively working on programming or doing work or networking, we can incorporate our academic partners, the Ideas Research Lab. And so what's really cool, and I kind of get really excited about this, is it gives us an opportunity to connect people at a level that we've never seen before. And whether that be allies with allies, racialized persons with racialized persons, young people with experienced people. But 2, it's giving us an opportunity to actually leave a legacy. So for example, I can tell you about some of the difficult sport experiences I've had, you know, whether it be because I'm a woman or because I'm young or because, you know, I'm Black, but my story is only my story. It's gone when I'm gone. However, when we get to a level where we can create our own research and studies and provide an informative view and something that can be referred to, that's different, because now we get to a level where we can establish trends, where we could talk about, hey, this is what this looked like 5 years ago. This is what it should look like 5 years from now. And so the value that Janelle's team, and she's got like a whole lab, they actually operate out of the U of T's KIN program. Like, I can't even put it in words. Sport Information Resource Center actually gave us some funding to launch an evaluative almost overview and study on our first year of our Black Female Coach Mentorship Program. And it gave us an opportunity to create something tangible, something historic that can be referenced and used. Fast forward now, for example, with our hockey mentorship program that will roll out soon, we're partnering with the Ideas Research Lab again. And we want to get into the storytelling piece, right? And so once you start getting both of those, now we can talk about, because we're humans, right? It's all about that socialization piece. So we talk about storytelling, but then we're also not missing that. Here's the hard research that we need that can inform people, that can justify, you know, some of these experiences, that can justify some of what we need to do, that can validate these experiences. Now we're talking about impact on a different level. So Ideas Lab, indigeneity, diaspora, equity, and anti-racism in sport. You know, if I'm not mistaken, they're the only, you know, research-driven lab that's doing this sort of work in the sports community. We were actually content leaders, BCCA and the Ideas Research Lab, in the CAC project for the anti-racism in sport coaching e-learning module. And if you haven't taken it and you're watching this webinar, please do take it and give us your feedback on it. You know, it was awesome. We actually created a committee as well that was representative from people across all levels of sport across the country. But, you know, it was an honor to work on the project. We're really happy with the work we put out, but we know the work isn't done, and we know not everything, you know, could have gone into it. But again, going back to that research piece, please take a look at it. You know, and just kind of looking at how we're continuing to see some light being shed on the statistics and you know, what organizations are starting, you know, to do and continue to do in the anti-racism space. So on the bottom right there, it's a screenshot of a study that CBC Sports did. And I can just read it out. 400 top positions at 56 Canadian universities. These would be universities that have athletic departments. Only 10% are filled by a Black person, Indigenous person, or person of color. And just underneath that, it's kind of colored out there, but it says only one of the 56 is occupied by a non-white person, right? So there's a lot of work to be done. I mentioned a few examples. Cheryl at TWU, actually York has done a number of stuff as well. U of T, but we have a long way to go, right? And so when I reference Dr. Ivan Joseph, you know, back when he was the only Black athletic director, you know, we're kind of still in that space right now. And so in terms of that leadership position, you know, it's definitely something that we want to continue to tackle. These are pictures of some of the outcome-based initiatives that have come from the call to action, and continuing to talk about anti-racism and advance it and help normalize some of these conversations. On the bottom left, we see a historic report that was created by the Ideas Research Lab in partnership with the OUA. I mentioned Gord Grace being the president and CEO, playing a huge role in terms of bringing them on board. And just to give you an idea of how comprehensive this study was, so pretty much it was, what's the word I'm looking for? Like a survey or a report that, that every single, the goal was to get every single student, athlete, coach, and administrator, regardless of racialized background, to fill it out, right? And so, because what we didn't want to do is, do a study that's only for the racialized people, because then it's only giving us information on their experiences. What we really wanted to do is, hey, are we seeing different experiences based on, the ethnic background of people, right? So the RW1 study, super comprehensive, definitely worth a read. What I like about it is easy to read. So, if you're a little overwhelmed about reading a long study, it's done really well. It's aesthetic. It's got some insights in there. And again, it's OUA specific. We definitely want to get to the level where we're seeing what this looks like at an RSEC level. So that would be our Quebec region. We want to see what this looks like at an AUS level, which is our Maritime and Eastern Canada region. And we want to see what this looks like at Canada West. On the bottom right, we see Nipissing Lakers to host historic anti-racism basketball game, shoot for change. So this is an interesting one. There's a young gentleman named Tajon Eccleston Graham. He's actually a current student athlete at Nipissing. And Tajon is our student liaison for the BCCA. And one of the things that we started advocating for pretty early on as an organization, but also as university sport coaches, were fundraising initiatives based on things that we do anyways, like have specialty games. So in women's basketball every year, we fundraise money for breast cancer. It's we call it the Shoot for a Cure initiative. And so the Shoot for Change, the term is actually something that a couple of us basketball coaches were talking about. And it's something that, again, for Tajon as a current student athlete to take something like this up and lead it and actually see it come to fruition is so inspiring to me. He's the founder of an organization called Athletes for Change that actually connects student athletes across the Canadian sport landscape for these sorts of things. On the top left, we see U Sports Conversation. So really the first time that as on a higher level, we see U Sports come together to acknowledge Black History or African Heritage Month. But then also use it as a means to acknowledge individuals and again, continue some of these conversations around where we need to go and where we are now. And on the top right, we see just a screenshot of the cover of the OUA AGM report that was put together by the Black, Biracial, and Indigenous Task Force, headed by Gord Grace, and then eventually by the name escapes me, but individuals in our sport and corporate landscape. And so I think the BBI is still a thing now. And I actually wanted to shout out the OUA because they actually just created a job called the EDI student support position. And when we talk about the things that we're advocating for as a society, as a sport community, even for us as a BCCA, it's understanding the value in positions like that. Okay, and I wanted to talk about what this maybe has looked like for some NSOs, national sport organizations, and provincial territory sport organizations. So your Team Ontarios and your coaching organizations and your Football Canadas, et cetera. Like we've seen a lot of work being done in this space across the country. I think there's definitely been levels of progression with some, like again, going back to are we just making a statement or are we doing something following the statement? I think that's a different conversation. I think we would say pull up receipts and continue to look at, what does this look like for this year? It's 2022. Is this still a strategic initiative for us? Is it a KPI? Like, what are we doing here? But yeah, just some photos here on the far right, you'll see the CCMHS. And it actually was co-founded by Krista Van Slingerland, who's a former basketball female athlete from the Ottawa Carleton area. And Krista, she actually struggled with depression and had thoughts of suicide as a struggling student athlete. And so she actually, I think she did a master's and a PhD in this space. And their organization is one that we connected with really early on to see what we can do. And we're able to establish a Black student athlete fund at the CCMHS to support with things like education diagnoses, for racialized student athletes, funding for psych-related supports, right? Like a psychiatrist or a psychologist that are facilitated. So even the CCMHS actually it's still relatively new as an organization, but doing a ton of work in this space. We see kind of just like with Canada basketball, we see Volleyball Canada come out here with a statement. Kind of in the top middle, we see the Community Sport Organization of the Year, Black Lives Matter Golf. So we see some intentionality around inclusivity for racialized persons in sports that historically have not been racialized, or maybe I shouldn't say racialized, but have not included groups like this on a mass scale. Right, Sports Nova Scotia is in on it. On the bottom left, we see the Coaching Association of Ontario's Coaches for Change initiative, and they actually put together a committee that works year-round around some of this inclusivity. Town halls were something that they did pretty early on. BIPOC mentorships as well is something that they've been able to launch. And what I really like about the CAO is it seems like almost every other province looks to them as leaders as well. So for them to do this, you know, it now is encouraging to other provincial organizations to do the same. On the right there, we see in the middle, Mark Smith. Mark Smith is a Olympian and super successful former softball athlete, current coach. Last I checked, he was the executive director for Sport Nova Scotia. And he launched a Black and Indigenous coach mentorship program. I think it just finished off their first year there. I think it was a 2-year program. And you know, mentors were comprised of racialized and non-racialized coaches to support racialized persons in their coaching journeys. And as you can see, just in, you know, incorporating NCCP programming, in-person and virtual mentorship and workshops. And then on the left there, we see Hockey Nova Scotia launching the Black Youth Ice Hockey Program that actually has been going on for a while now. And yeah, I mean, the hockey conversation is interesting. I can tell you a lot about basketball, but you know, I was able to uncover that, you know, here on the East Coast, there's a very rich history of people of color and hockey. And I won't go into the details because I know you will do some research after this. But the Black Youth Ice Hockey Program is phenomenal, and it's one that I think is going to be or is in the works to be replicated at other provinces. And you know, that's the goal. You know, as we get to our end here, I want everyone to kind of think about some of the information that we discussed and the things that we've seen. Maybe some of this information is familiar, maybe some of it isn't, but ultimately I want us to think about how we can continue to work together as a sport community and advance racial equity. And we see that more diversity in terms of the leadership level, more conversations around who's missing at the table, putting a more equity-based lens on how we do sport and how we think about recruiting, how we think about marketing programs, how we think about doing business. You know, the more variety we have, the more difference of thought we have. And difference of thought, I think, comes from different lived experiences. I think we're going to continue to improve our sport experience. I think we're going to see less people stepping away from sport, whether it be as athletes and coaches, you know, and I really think our best days are ahead of us. So I hope that this presentation has given you some insight, maybe some familiar, maybe some new, but certainly has led you to think about, hey, here are different things that are going on to advance racial equity. But you know, what does it mean for us right now? I actually feel like there's a lot going on, but I don't think that many of us know, you know, everything that's going on. You know, are there ways that we can connect, whether it be at community levels, at formal PSO, NSO levels, you know, our professional organizations going to try to bring this all together. I'm not too sure. I think for me, and in terms of the little that I can do, I'm going to continue to use the BCCA as a platform that connects, that empowers, that celebrates, and that's kind of what we want to do. But I encourage anybody watching this to think about, hey, where are we going from here, and how can I help in this process? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Coach Lee. I am inspired, and I am incredibly grateful that you took the time to share all of that information, to share your story, and to share what's going on. I think it's so important. I have some questions I want to dive into. I really like that you brought up the lack of research, because I think this is something that people don't fully understand. Like, the research doesn't necessarily exist. And I think Tracy Blake actually called it out last year on Twitter, like when it came to almost like even the scientific research, like it's missing, right? Like, why are we not doing this? Last week I was at the NHL Coaches Association conference, and Kim Davis, who's their senior VP, she brought up this comment. She goes, trying to, like, looking at these advancements, we have Mike Greer just got named as a GM in the NHL, the first Black GM, and we have these women, and she's like, how do we know, or how do we move it from being a moment to a movement? And I think that research, the way you brought up that research part, is so important. And I'm wondering, like, what do you see as, like, what is the necessary research that needs to be done? What is missing?
I look at, so to me, the study that the OUA was able to do, I think presents one of the best ways to kind of start a foundation for the research that can then get us to that point of, hey, okay, let's go a level deeper. Like, what does this mean for South Asian groups? What does this mean for different religious groups? And I think the challenge always becomes like what is too overwhelming and what's just enough? And I think what worked at the OUA level is that, like, there was just buy-in within that conference. And so it was not to say it was easy, but the funneling of information of what was needed, and then how that rollout happened, it started from a leadership position, but then everyone was able to be informed on how they could play a role, right? And so whether I'm a racialized person or not, just me filling out the survey is my act of supporting. And I think organizations need to have this kind of approach. Like, it can't just be, we're just doing something and now we forgot it about 2 years from now, right? Like, how do we make it more tangible? How do we make it more real? How do we give ourselves precedence, right? Kind of like law, when someone's like, oh, like, yeah, we like RV, you know, like you're thinking about things that have happened so that it can inform your best practices. I think for our sport community, like, actually having a hub that we can go to would be super impactful. I just don't feel like there's one now. And then again, what does that look like? Is there one for coaches? Is there one for athletes? But I don't think that there's one specific place. I think each sport organization, just going back to your question, I think each sport organization needs to create buy-in to conduct something that's survey-based, right? And this is the other thing. We have to think about people who've come before us, because those are, like, that's just as important as, it's not, I'm not saying it's more important, but it's just as important as the people that we're asking now. Even with the Black Tuesday thing, a lot of stuff wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for alumni saying, hey, actually, as a matter of fact, and like that, like, and because they've got no skin in the game, it actually was easier because they could be really honest without the fear of anything happening punitively, like I said too much, I spoke up too much. And so, you know, I think there's some strategy around that, but it's going to look different for everyone. You know, hockey alone has gone through so many changes, and it's still not, I guess it's still not, I wouldn't consider it harmonious, but we're seeing, like, good things happen. And so for those good things, can we kind of bridge that gap?
I'm glad you brought up the OA thing, because I wanted to ask, and I as soon as you said that you surveyed all athletes, it made me go, I wonder if that's the right strategy, because as soon as you were talking about that, of like, athletes sharing their experience, I thought about the safe sport aspect and the fact that so many athletes wouldn't want to share their experience out of fear of retribution, like because that sport organization still has control. So do you think by opening it up, do you think that gave a little more freedom for athletes to share their experience?
Absolutely, because it was all anonymous. And so there was nothing that was going to get traced back to athletes or coaches or administrators. And so like that, and like that study, if you haven't seen it, Amy, it's really, really cool. Like it's more than just cool. Like there's a lot more adjectives you can use to describe it, but it just worked because there was so much higher level strategy around how do we get the most, and the most being people's honest experiences and honest opinions. Like, like ADs were asked, do you feel like racism is an issue? And, overall, the answer was no. But even that, like that in and of itself was telling, because the student athlete experience was quite the opposite for a racialized person, right? So, and again, it's not to say you're a bad person, but again, it gives us that we're not saying this is your bad. We're saying here's the information now, as unbiased as can be, and we're not worrying about that retribution piece. Now we can take this information and talk about what's next. And when I think about like even the EDI student support position that they created, I think that's an outcome from the study. I think that's what Agord Grace would probably say.
Which I think is fantastic that there is that actual part, because I'm thinking even like, I think it was Sport Canada, like looked at how many women were in coach roles at the university level in Canada. And the numbers are terrible. But then you go, well, what's the actionable? Like there hasn't actually been that action. So it's like, how are we actually going to utilize that data to make appropriate change?
Exactly.
Which is why I think like I loved your, like I have it underlined and multiple times, but the intentionality, like how can we be intentional about what we're doing? That actually brought up I have a couple more questions. One was with the Shoot for Change, and because you mentioned Shoot for the Cure, and that's across U Sport, like that event occurs everywhere.
Absolutely.
Is Shoot for Change something that you think can be utilized across? Because I'm emailing UBC right now and going like, if you have all these others, why don't you have this?
Exactly. So the pitch was, and we wanted to just do it in a basketball space first and then get the other sports to jump on, just because communications wise, all of the the sports meet like that. But the idea was for every team to run their own fundraising initiative under the Shoot for a Change kind of name, and in turn take that funding and turn it into different supports for racialized student athletes, bursaries, grants. We know that systemically there's already challenges with different marginalized groups such as newcomers, immigrant groups that are trying to navigate that space. And we also know because there's a bench line you have to hit to receive your athletic scholarship, that also is a gap as well. And so a lot of coaches that we spoke to expressed frustrations about not being able to support student athletes appropriately. I mean, technically, you can't even give them grocery cards, right? So it's not just like money in hand, it's like around all these other things when we're asking them to be superstars on the field of play for us. And so we thought it was something that was doable. Again, there's already an established precedent, and you're going to have, in basketball, you have a 20-game season, and it's no different than if we're having one for Shoot for a Cure, we're having one to speak out against sexual violence, for example. We think that there is sustainability, and again, you can actually just use that as a piece to fundraise for this. It might be an emergency fund for any student athlete that needs support. Like, so we started to even think outside of just the racialized student athlete space, and just, at this U Sport level, because it's a lot more different than, $70,000 scholarships. How can we actually support?
Yeah, and I think that's fantastic. And I will definitely be emailing UBC Athletics and be like, make it happen.
Yeah, it's super easy. It's so easy. Yeah. It's so easy.
Yeah. My other question was, is about the Black Coaches Association. And it's funny because I was talking to, again, at the NHL thing, they also have a Black coaches mentorship as part of the NHLCA. And I was speaking to them and he had no clue your organization existed. So I'm like, big question is like, how do coaches get involved?
Absolutely. So our website is thebcca.com, and we're on Twitter and Instagram as well. And I would say like it was a lot, I wouldn't say easier, but when everything was virtual, we had a lot more kind of content going out. Like the challenge is our whole executive team is pretty much like full-time coaches. So we're a fully volunteer run organization. And so what's been big for us is when we have received funding, we've been able to outsource like administrative support, program managers for our coaching mentorship programs and so forth. But actually anybody could be a member of the BCCA. It's a free membership online. It takes 30 seconds to register. We have like a MailChimp newsletters that we do quarterly. And then what's really cool is we have these WhatsApp groups. So I would say like 95% of people who are BCCA members will contact them. Thanks for joining our group. Would you like to be added to our WhatsApp group? And it's really cool because we've got sports specific. So we've got like hockey, we've got a multi-sport, we've got football, basketball, soccer, athletics. And then we call it our anti-racism experts. And those are actually like our university professors, master's students, graduate students, sport historians. And then we have our holistic health group, and that ranges from racialized and non-racialized, like chiropractors, strength and conditioning coaches, like holistic wellness coaches. And so each of these groups kind of converses differently based on the time of year it is, what's going on in the sport group. I mean, I know our basketball one gets pretty pumping because, hey, I got free tickets to the whatever game. And then in our multi-sport, hey, I got these MLB tickets. So it's awesome because it's connected people that otherwise, like in some cases, would never ever meet each other. So it's because we've got about, I think something like 900 members like across all of Canada in different sports. And then it's easy for us to like, hey, there's a job that's gone up, like, let's go ahead and share it. And sometimes that's where some of the gaps have been. Like, hey, like who's actually applying for this job, but who knows about the job? You know what I mean? And like doing that, but yeah, so that's kind of how we've been operating right now. A lot of our stories that we published have been around like just celebrating what different people of color are doing in the space, updates on what we have going on now. So like, I think our next one will be around the hockey coach mentorship program. We hope to feature in some facet like our mentors and our mentees in our inaugural program. And then we're always looking to see not how we can reinvent the wheel, but just amplify what other people are doing. So yeah, like whether it be individuals or organizations. I think the tough thing becomes like when like an individual will hit me up and be like, hey, Coach Lee, like, can you like push this for me to this specific group? And I'm like, listen, I could just add you to the group and you go. Because unfortunately, I also have a full-time job and work part-time and et cetera. But yeah, the only thing holding us back is honestly like a few supports, like so that we can like pay somebody and some people to kind of keep things moving. But we're really happy with what we've been able to do. And at least with the programs that we're running, it's something that we feel like is sustainable.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And thank you for everything you're doing. Yeah, this has been fantastic, incredibly educational, and I've got some research to do, so.
Thanks, Amy. Yeah, I ended it by saying, where do we go from here? And I feel like that's like a whole nother, like, because again, it's just, there's a million places to go, right? And when I speak to like higher level sport administrators, like nobody wants to feel like they're checking the box, but it's also like, you can't try to do too much because there's so much in this space. And so, as like in my coaching hat, I'm just like, let's do what we can really well so that it creates a really good foundational piece that we can continue to build on it. In a perfect world, we snap our fingers and like, racism is gone. Women have equal rights in sport. There's gender equity, but it's just not realistic. So like, let's be super intentional about, how we can grow in this space. And I think, like there's some incredible people I talked about today. There's definitely some people I should have talked about that just, but it's happening. It's happening. I'd like to see us come together once a year and celebrate this, like like run like something sport conference based around some of the EDI stuff.
Yeah, and I hope it happens, because I think it deserves to be celebrated. So
for sure.
Well, thank you so much. And good luck with everything you have going on, because I know you are a busy lady.
Thank you, Amy. I appreciate it. And thanks so much for the platform and just the opportunity to kind of talk about stuff that's gone on in the space. And the way I presented is kind of how my brain works. Like there's not really like a start and an end. It's just like, you know, like all this stuff is impacting one another and working together, you know. But yeah, I'm very glad I was able to speak at this conference this year.
Thank you so much.